The gas lamps had long since guttered. George Yard lay swallowed in the particular darkness that belonged only to Whitechapel, a darkness thick with coal smoke, with the breath of 1,000 sleepers stacked in rotting tenements, with the silence that falls between the last drunk stumble and the first factory bell. It was the small hours of August the 7th, 1888. The heat of summer clung to the cobblestones like fever. Somewhere in the maze of alleys, a woman's footsteps had stopped. Martha Tabram lay on the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings. Her eyes were open, fixed upon nothing. Her body was still warm, and in her flesh, counted later by trembling hands, were 39 wounds. 39 separate entries of a blade into bone and organ. The violence was not quick. It was not merciful. It was something else entirely, something that Whitechapel had not yet learned to name. No one had heard a scream. No one had heard a struggle. The stones of the stairwell held their silence, as stones always do. Above her, the residents slept on, and in the streets beyond, the creature who had done this walked free beneath the fading stars, unwitnessed, unnamed, and utterly without remorse. Chapter 1. The Lamplit Abyss. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has drawn its curtain, and wherever you find yourself in this quiet hour, you are safe now. Let the weight of the waking world slip away. Before we begin our journey into the past, take a moment. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what hour has the clock struck in your corner of the world? Leave your answer below, a small greeting from across time and distance. And if you have not yet done so, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving your mark upon this video. A like, a comment, a moment of your presence. It helps more than you know, allowing these whispered histories to reach others who seek refuge in the dark. Now then, let us lower the lights, let us quiet the mind, and let us drift backward, past the noise of this modern age, past the glow of electric screens, past everything familiar, until we arrive at a place that no longer exists, yet has never truly disappeared. We go now to London, to the East End, to the summer of 1888, and to a district called Whitechapel. The name itself carried weight in those days, though not the weight of history or not yet. To those who lived beyond its borders, Whitechapel was spoken of in hushed tones, if it was spoken of at all. It was a place respectable citizens did not visit, did not acknowledge, and did not wish to understand. It squatted in the shadow of the city's prosperity like a wound that would not heal, a labyrinth of narrow courts and sagging tenements, of gin palaces and doss houses, of open sewers and closed futures. One could walk from the gleaming banks of the City of London into the heart of Whitechapel in a matter of minutes, and yet the distance between those two worlds could not be measured in miles. It was measured in hope. And in Whitechapel, hope had long since been pawned for a night's lodging and a glass of something strong enough to blur the edges of despair. By the summer of 1888, the East End had become a repository for all that the Empire wished to forget. Irish families who had fled the Great Famine decades before still lived in cellars and cramped rooms, their children now grown into a second generation of poverty. Jewish refugees from the pogroms of Russia and Poland had arrived in great waves throughout the decade, crowding into the same streets, competing for the same meagre work in the sweatshops and tailoring dens that lined the commercial road. Sailors from every port in the world passed through on their way to or from the docks at Wapping and Shadwell, bringing with them foreign tongues, foreign coins, and foreign diseases. The native English poor, those born to the cobblestones and destined never to leave them, regarded each new arrival with suspicion and resentment, though they shared the same hunger, the same cold, the same grinding struggle to survive another day. The streets themselves seemed designed to confuse and contain. Whitechapel Road served as the main artery, a broad thoroughfare choked with traffic. Horse-drawn omnibuses, costermongers' carts, funeral processions for those who could afford them, and an endless tide of humanity moving in all directions at once. But step off that road into any of the side streets, and the world changed. Here were the alleys and courts where the true population dwelt, where sunlight rarely penetrated, where the buildings leaned so close together that a man could shake hands with his neighbour across the gap. Names like Flower and Dean Street, Dorset Street, Thrall Street, and George Yard were known to the police as some of the most dangerous addresses in England. To venture there at night without purpose, or without a weapon, was to invite disaster. The common lodging houses dominated this landscape of misery. For 4p, a man or woman could secure a bed for the night. Not a room, not even a corner, but a bed in a dormitory shared with dozens of strangers. The beds were narrow wooden frames strung with rope or canvas, arranged in rows like coffins awaiting their occupants. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of boiled cabbage, of cheap tobacco and cheaper gin. Vermin moved freely between sleepers. Theft was common, violence commonplace, and privacy non-existent. Yet for thousands upon thousands of Whitechapel's residents, these doss houses represented the only alternative to sleeping in the streets, in doorways, beneath railway arches, or in the open churchyards among the dead. For women, the calculus of survival was even more brutal. Work was scarce and poorly paid. A seamstress might earn a few shillings a week for labour that ruined her eyes and bent her spine. A charwoman might scrub floors from dawn until dusk for pennies that barely covered her lodging. When honest work failed, when illness struck, when age crept forward and strength declined, there remained one final economy. The streets of Whitechapel after dark were crowded with women who sold the only commodity they had left to sell. They were not professionals in the continental sense, not courtesans or kept women or inhabitants of elegant houses. They were the desperate, the destitute, the abandoned. Many were wives whose husbands had died or disappeared. Many were mothers whose children had been taken by disease or the workhouse. They walked the streets not by choice but by necessity, accepting a few pennies from any man willing to pay, retreating into shadowed doorways and filthy courts to conduct transactions that lasted only minutes before returning to seek another customer, another coin, another chance to survive until morning. The police who patrolled these streets understood the reality even if they could not condone it. The Metropolitan Police's H Division, responsible for Whitechapel and its environs, was perpetually understaffed and overwhelmed. The men who walked the night beats knew every alley, every court, every public house where trouble brewed. They knew the faces of the habitual criminals, the fences, the pickpockets, the bullies and roughs who preyed upon the weak. They knew the women too, not by name necessarily, but by sight, by the weariness in their eyes, by the way they moved through the gaslight. To arrest every woman who solicited would have been impossible. The courts would have been swamped, the cells overflowing, and the streets no cleaner for it. And so, an uneasy tolerance prevailed. The police moved the women along when they gathered too visibly, broke up fights when they turned bloody, and collected the bodies when they turned up dead. For death was no stranger to Whitechapel. It moved through the district with the ease of an old resident, claiming its due in 100 different forms. Disease was the most reliable harvester. Cholera and typhoid bred in the fouled water supplies. Tuberculosis spread through the overcrowded lodging houses. Smallpox and scarlet fever carried off children by the score. Malnutrition weakened bodies until the slightest illness became fatal. Alcohol poisoning claimed those who sought escape at the bottom of a bottle. Industrial accidents mangled workers in the factories and warehouses. And then there was violence, the sudden eruption of rage between strangers or intimates. The knife drawn in a quarrel over money or love or nothing at all. The body found floating in the Thames or crumpled in a gutter with no witness willing to speak. In such a place, murder was not remarkable. It was regrettable, certainly, and investigated when possible, but it did not make headlines. The respectable newspapers of London rarely trouble themselves with the deaths of Whitechapel's poor. A line or two in the police reports, a paragraph in the local press, and then silence. The victim was buried, in a pauper's grave if no family claimed the body, and the world moved on. No one expected justice. No one demanded answers. The poor died as they had lived, unnoticed, unmourned, unnamed. It was into this world that the summer of 1888 descended with unusual cruelty. The heat that year was oppressive, hanging over London like a fever. The stench of the streets intensified, rising from the open drains and accumulating in the airless courts. Tempers frayed, desperation deepened, and somewhere, moving through those lamplit shadows, something new had awakened. Something that would transform Whitechapel from a byword for poverty into a name that would echo through the centuries synonymous with terror. But that transformation had not yet occurred. In the first week of August, Whitechapel remained what it had always been, a place where life was cheap, where death was common, and where the darkness held no special menace beyond the ordinary cruelties of existence. The residents who walked its streets on the night of August the 6th, 1888, had no reason to believe that this night would be different from any other. The public houses were full, the lodging houses were crowded, the women were walking, and among them, moving through the crowds with a face that no one would remember, was a woman called Martha. She had lived 39 years upon the earth, though she looked older. She had known marriage and abandonment, motherhood and loss, work and want. She had descended, rung by rung, down the ladder of Victorian society until she reached the lowest step, where the only way forward was to keep walking, keep drinking, keep surviving one night at a time. On this particular evening she had a few coins in her pocket and a companion by her side. She had no way of knowing that these were her final hours, that she'd already met the man who would kill her, that before the dawn broke she would become the first entry in a ledger of blood that would never be closed. The lamplighters had done their work. The gas flames hissed and flickered in their iron casings, casting pools of yellow light that only made the surrounding darkness seem deeper. Whitechapel settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the shouts and laughter from the public houses, the shuffle of feet on cobblestones, the distant clatter of a hansom cab on the main road, and beneath it all, beneath the noise and the motion and the desperate commerce of the night, there was something else. A presence, a purpose, a shadow moving with intent through the lamplit abyss. History would later try to name it. History would fail. Chapter 2. The woman called Emma. She was born Martha White in the borough of Southwark in the year 1849. The London of her infancy was not so different from the London that would witness her death. The same fog, the same coal smoke, the same river sliding black and silent through the heart of the city. Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 12 years already, and would remain there for more than half a century to come, presiding over an empire that stretched across the globe while failing to illuminate the shadows in its own capital. Martha entered this world in a modest household, neither wealthy nor destitute, one of 5 children born to Charles White, a warehouseman, and his wife Elizabeth. The details of her childhood have been lost to time, as the childhoods of the poor so often are, recorded in no diary, commemorated in no portrait, surviving only in the bare entries of parish registers and census returns. She was baptized. She grew. She learned whatever a girl of her station was expected to learn: how to keep house, how to sew, how to make do with little and expect less. And when she reached the age of matrimony, she did what women of her class were supposed to do. She married. His name was Henry Samuel Tabram, and he was a foreman packer at a furniture warehouse. The wedding took place on Christmas Day, 1869, at Trinity Church in the parish of Newington. Martha was 20 years old. Henry was somewhat older, a man with steady employment and respectable prospects. For a time it seemed that Martha had secured herself a life of modest stability, the kind of life that might not bring joy, but could at least keep want from the door. Within a few years she bore 2 sons, the continuation of the Tabram name, the promise of a future that extended beyond her own brief span. The family lived in various addresses across South London, moving as circumstances dictated, never settling long enough to put down roots, but never falling so far as to lose their footing entirely. But something was wrong. Something had always been wrong, perhaps, or had gone wrong so gradually that no one could say precisely when the trouble began. Martha drank. This was not unusual in itself. Gin was cheap, beer was safer than water in many districts, and the public houses served as the living rooms of the poor, the only warm and lit spaces available to those whose homes were cold and dark. But Martha's drinking was of a different order. It was not social. It was not moderate. It was the desperate, determined consumption of someone trying to drown something that would not stay submerged. Henry Tabram tolerated it for as long as he could. He pleaded with her to stop. He threatened. He raged. Nothing worked. The bottles emptied and refilled, and the woman he had married on that Christmas morning slowly disappeared into someone he no longer recognized. By 1875, the marriage was over in all but name. Henry had had enough. He could not watch her destroy herself, could not watch her drag their sons down into the mire of her addiction. He left, taking the boys with him, and Martha was alone. The separation was not clean. Nothing ever was among the poor. Henry agreed to pay her 12 shillings a week, a sum that might have been enough to keep her in a lodging house with a little left over for food. Had she been capable of managing money? Had she been capable of managing anything at all? But the payments became irregular as Martha's behaviour grew more erratic. She drank what he gave her. She pawned what she owned. She fell behind on her rent, was evicted, found another room, fell behind again. The downward spiral had begun, and there was no one left to catch her. It was during this period of drift that she encountered another man. His name was Henry Turner, a carpenter by trade, and for reasons that history does not record, he took up with the woman whom respectable society had already discarded. They lived together as man and wife, though they never married. Common law arrangements were standard among the poor, who could not afford the fees and formalities of legal union. For nearly 12 years, Turner and Martha moved through the East End together, sharing lodgings, sharing poverty, sharing whatever comfort 2 damaged people could offer one another in a world that offered them nothing else. Turner was not a wealthy man, but he worked steadily when work was available, and he did what he could to keep Martha housed and fed. But the drinking never stopped. It waxed and waned with circumstances. Better when Turner was earning, worse when he was not, worse still when some nameless sorrow rose up in Martha and demanded to be silenced. Turner bore it as Henry Tabram had borne it before him, with frustration and pity, and the slow erosion of whatever affection had first drawn him to her. He gave her money for food. She spent it on gin. He found them lodgings. She was thrown out for drunkenness and disorder. The pattern repeated itself so many times that it ceased to be a pattern and became simply the shape of their life together, a life defined by her need and his exhaustion. 3 weeks before her death, Henry Turner finally reached the end of his endurance. He had tried everything he knew how to try. He had begged, cajoled, threatened, forgiven, and tried again. Nothing worked. Nothing would ever work. Martha was beyond his help, beyond anyone's help, and to stay with her any longer was to drown alongside her. He left. The break was not dramatic. There were no screams, no violence, no final confrontation. He simply stopped coming back to their lodgings, stopped giving her money, stopped pretending that tomorrow would be any different from today. Martha was alone again, truly alone this time, with no husband and no common law partner, and no sons and no family willing to take her in. She was 39 years old, and she had nothing left but the clothes on her back, and the thirst that would not let her rest. She fell then into the final economy of Whitechapel. There was no other choice, not for a woman of her age and circumstances, with no skills that anyone would pay for and no references that anyone would trust. She walked the streets. She solicited men in public houses and shadowed doorways. She accepted whatever coins they offered and retreated with them into the darkness to earn her keep in the oldest way. It was not a profession she had chosen. It was simply what remained when everything else had been stripped away. She was not young, not pretty, not possessed of any particular charm that might attract a better class of customer. She was simply available and cheap and desperate enough to say yes to anyone who asked. During these final weeks, she went by another name. She called herself Emma, or sometimes Emma Turner, borrowing the surname of the man who had abandoned her. Perhaps because it was easier to remember. Perhaps because she wished to preserve some small shred of her former identity. Perhaps for no reason at all. The other women who walked the same streets knew her by this name. The keepers of the lodging houses where she sought beds knew her by this name. The men who paid for her company knew her by this name, if they bothered to ask for a name at all. Martha Tabram had effectively ceased to exist. In her place walked Emma, a ghost wearing the shell of a woman, moving through the lamplit streets in search of enough pennies to purchase another night's survival, another drink to blur the edges of what she had become. She had a friend of sorts in those final days. Her name was Mary Ann Connolly, though she was known in Whitechapel by the nickname Pearly Pole, a reference to the buttons she wore on her clothing in the style of the costermonger queens. Pearly Pole was of the same profession, walking the same streets, serving the same clientele. The two women were not close in the way that respectable women might be close. There was no time for intimacy, no energy for deep connection, in a life consumed by the daily struggle to survive. But they drank together when they had money, looked out for one another when they could, and provided the only companionship either of them had in a world that had long since turned its back on both. It was with Pearly Pole that Martha spent her final evening. The night of August the 6th, 1888, was warm and close, the air heavy with the humidity of a London summer. The public houses were full, the streets were busy, and the bank holiday crowds provided ample opportunity for two women seeking paying customers. Martha and Pearly Pole set out together, as they often did, moving through the familiar territory of Whitechapel Road and its surrounding lanes, drinking when they could afford to drink, watching for likely men, and waiting for the night to bring whatever it would bring. Neither woman knew, as they walked through those gaslit streets, that one of them would not see another dawn. Neither woman knew that this unremarkable evening would become the subject of inquests and investigations, of newspaper headlines and police reports, of theories that would persist for more than a century. They were simply two women doing what they did every night, surviving as best they could in a world that had offered them nothing but hard choices and harder consequences. Martha Tabram, Emma Turner, the woman with two names and no future, walked into the darkness of the bank holiday night, and the darkness closed behind her like a door. The candles in the lodging houses burned low, the public houses began to empty, and somewhere in the maze of Whitechapel streets, fate was already moving toward its appointment. Chapter 3. The Bank Holiday Night orchestrated narrative progression through historical fiction chapters. Now I'll write Chapter 3 about the Bank Holiday Night, keeping the same style and tone. This chapter covers the evening of August 6th, the drinking in public houses, and the encounter with the soldiers. The first Monday of the August was a bank holiday, and London had given itself over to celebration with the weary determination of a city that rarely found cause to celebrate at all. The factories had closed their gates, the warehouses had locked their doors, and the working poor of the East End had spilled into the streets to spend what little money they had on what little pleasure they could afford. The public houses were packed from opening until well past midnight. The music halls offered their programs of song and spectacle to audiences who hooted and stamped and demanded encores. Street vendors hawked meat pies and fried fish and penny ices to crowds that milled along the pavements in the long summer twilight. For one day at least, the grinding routine of survival was suspended, and Whitechapel put on its tawdry best. Martha Tabram and Pearly Poll began their evening early, as was their custom. The holiday meant more men in the streets, more money flowing through the public houses, more opportunities for women of their profession to find customers willing to pay for company. They met in the early evening and set out together, moving through the familiar circuit of drinking establishments that lined Whitechapel Road and its tributaries. The Two Brewers on Brick Lane, the White Swan on the High Street. A dozen other places whose names have been lost to time, whose locations can only be guessed from the fragmentary testimony that would later be extracted from witnesses who had been too drunk to remember clearly and too frightened to speak honestly. The two women drank as they walked, never staying long in any one place, always moving, always watching. The public houses were crowded with holiday makers, with soldiers on leave from the nearby barracks, with sailors up from the docks, with working men flush with a few days' wages and eager to spend them. Martha and Pearly Poll were not particular. They could not afford to be particular. They accepted drinks from anyone who offered, smiled at anyone who seemed interested, and waited for the opportunities that the evening would surely provide. It was sometime around 10 o'clock, or perhaps a little later, when they encountered the two soldiers. The details of this meeting would become crucial in the weeks that followed, picked over by police investigators and coroners' juries, yet they remained frustratingly vague even then. Pearly Poll would later testify that she and Martha had fallen in with a pair of soldiers. Privates, she thought, from the uniforms they wore, though she could not say with certainty which regiment they belonged to. The men had been drinking, as everyone had been drinking, and they were in good spirits, looking for entertainment of the sort that two willing women might provide. Introductions were made, or perhaps they were not. Names were exchanged, or perhaps they were not. In the democracy of the public house, in the anonymity of the holiday crowd, such formalities seemed unnecessary. The four of them drank together for the next several hours, moving from pub to pub in a haze of alcohol and laughter and the easy intimacy that money could buy. The soldiers paid for the drinks, as soldiers were expected to do when entertaining female companions. Martha and Pearly Poll reciprocated with attention and flattery, and the unspoken promise of what would come later, when the public houses closed and the streets grew quiet. It was a transaction as old as warfare itself, a commerce that had flourished in every garrison town and port city since the legions of Rome first made camp in foreign lands. The soldiers wanted what soldiers always wanted after weeks of barracks discipline and drill. The women wanted what they always wanted, money enough to survive another day. Both parties understood the terms. No negotiation was necessary. The night wore on. The crowds in the public houses thinned as midnight approached and the holiday drew toward its close. The gas lamps flickered in the summer heat, casting their yellow glow over streets that had grown quieter, more shadowed, more suited to the business that Martha and Pearly Poll had in mind. By 11:30, the time had come to conclude the evening's negotiations. The four companions left the last public house together and stepped into the darkness of Whitechapel's back streets. What happened next would be reconstructed only imperfectly from Pearly Poll's later testimony that she gave reluctantly and changed more than once as the investigation proceeded. She claimed that the group had walked together for a short distance before separating into pairs, herself with one soldier, Martha with the other. This was standard practice. Two women working together provided safety in numbers during the early part of the evening, but when it came time to conduct actual business, privacy was required. Each pair would find its own dark corner, its own doorway or alley or stairwell, and the transactions would be completed separately. Afterward, if all went well, the women would meet again to compare earnings and perhaps seek additional customers before the night was through. Pearly Poll stated that she had taken her soldier into Angel Alley, a narrow passage that connected Whitechapel High Street to the warren of courts beyond. There, in the darkness, she had conducted her business quickly and without incident. The soldier had paid what he owed, or perhaps a little less, and had gone his way. Pearly Poll had then returned to the streets to look for Martha, but her companion was nowhere to be found. This was not unusual. Martha might have taken longer with her customer. She might have found another customer afterward. She might have gone to a lodging house to sleep off the evening's drink. Pearly Poll did not worry. She did not search. She simply went about her own business, seeking what additional trade the remaining hours of darkness might provide, and assumed that she would see Martha again the following day, as she always did. But Martha would not be seen again. Not alive. The soldier whom Martha had accompanied into the night remained for weeks afterward, a figure of shadow and speculation. Pearly Poll described him only vaguely. A private, she thought, though she was not certain of his rank. He wore a white band around his cap, which might have indicated any of several regiments stationed in the area. He was young, or at least not old. He had a face that she could not recall clearly, a voice that she could not remember, a name that she had never learned or had immediately forgotten. He was, in short, the kind of man who passed through Whitechapel, by the hundreds, every night, anonymous, interchangeable, invisible in the crowd until the moment when he chose to step forward into the light of history. Martha walked with this man into George Yard, a narrow passage that ran between Whitechapel High Street and Wentworth Street, flanked on either side by tall tenement buildings whose windows looked down upon the cobblestones like blank and watching eyes. George Yard building stood partway along this passage, a block of model dwellings, built some years earlier to provide improved housing for the working poor, now already falling into the same decay that claimed everything in Whitechapel sooner or later. The building had a central stairwell, accessible from the street, leading up to the various flats on the floors above. It was a place of shadows and echoes, of sleeping families and restless children, of doors that did not quite close and locks that did not quite work. It was the kind of place where a woman might take a customer for a few hurried minutes of commerce, where the darkness provided cover and the residents minded their own business. Martha Tabram climbed those stairs sometime in the small hours of August the 7th. She climbed them with a man whose name no one would ever learn, whose face no one would ever identify, whose motives no one would ever understand. She climbed them expecting to earn a few pennies, to complete a transaction she had completed 1,000 times before, to descend again into the street and continue her search for the night's next opportunity. She had no reason to believe that this customer was different from any other. She had no reason to be afraid. The stairwell was dark. The residents were asleep, and whatever happened next happened in silence, in secrecy, in the perfect privacy of a place where no one cared to look and no one dared to intervene. The hours passed. The bank holiday ended. Tuesday, August the 7th, began its slow approach, and on the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings, Martha Tabram lay still and cooling, her blood spreading across the stones, her eyes open to a darkness that would never lift. Chapter 4. The Soldier and the Shadow. The last hours of Martha Tabram's life remain obscured by the same darkness that swallowed her body. The testimony of Pearly Poll, given days later under police questioning, provided only the barest outline of events: the drinking, the soldiers, the parting at the entrance to George Yard. What happened after that parting has been the subject of speculation and theory for more than a century, but the truth is simple and terrible. No one knows. No one saw Martha climb the stairs of George Yard buildings. No one heard her speak her final words. No one witnessed the attack that ended her life. The silence of that night has never been broken. But there were others who moved through the darkness of George Yard in those early morning hours, and their testimony would later provide fragments of a narrative that could never be fully assembled. A police constable named Thomas Barrett, walking his beat along Wentworth Street, encountered a soldier loitering near the entrance to George Yard sometime between 2 and 2:30 in the morning. The soldier was a young man, a private, dressed in the uniform of the Grenadier Guards. Barrett asked him what he was doing there, alone, at such an hour? The soldier replied that he was waiting for a friend who had gone off with a girl. This was not an unusual answer. Soldiers often waited for their companions to conclude such business. Barrett thought nothing of it. He moved on along his beat, leaving the soldier standing in the shadows at the mouth of George Yard. Was this the man who had accompanied Martha into the darkness? Was this the man who had climbed those stairs beside her, who had pressed her against the wall of the landing, who had drawn a blade, or two blades, as the evidence would later suggest, and driven them into her body again and again and again? Or was this some other soldier entirely innocent of everything except the poor judgment to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong hour? The questions would be asked repeatedly in the weeks that followed. They would never be answered. Another witness came forward as the investigation proceeded, a young cab driver named Alfred Crowe, who resided in George Yard buildings and who had returned home at approximately 3:30 in the morning after finishing his night's work. Crowe climbed the stairs of the building in the darkness, his way lit only by whatever faint glow filtered in from the street. On the first-floor landing, he saw a figure lying on the ground. He assumed it was a vagrant, one of the homeless poor who sometimes crept into the building's stairwells to sleep, or perhaps a resident who had collapsed after too much drink. Such sights were common enough in Whitechapel. Crowe did not stop. He did not investigate. He stepped around the figure and continued up to his own lodgings, thinking nothing of it. He went to bed. He slept. Martha Tabram, if indeed it was she whom Crowe had seen, was already dead by then, or dying, her blood pooling on the cold stone beneath her, her wounds too numerous and too severe to permit survival. She lay there in the darkness while the building's residents slept above and below her, while the hours of the night crawled toward dawn, while the city around her stirred in the first grey light of morning. She lay there alone, as she had been alone for most of her 39 years, abandoned by husband and lover and family and friend, abandoned now even by the man who'd killed her, who had walked away down those same stairs and vanished into the labyrinth of Whitechapel's streets. The soldier whom Constable Barrett had encountered remained a tantalizing lead for the investigators, who would soon take up the case. Barrett's description was detailed enough to be useful. A young private of the Grenadier Guards, wearing the distinctive uniform of that regiment, with a good conduct badge on his sleeve indicating at least 2 years of service without serious disciplinary infractions. This was a man who could, in theory, be found. The Grenadier Guards were stationed at the Tower of London, a mere half-mile from George Yard. Their roles could be consulted, their men could be questioned, an identity parade could be arranged, and Barrett could be asked to pick out the soldier he had seen. All of this would indeed occur in the days following the murder. Barrett would be taken to the tower. The men of the Grenadier Guards would be assembled before him. He would walk along the ranks, studying faces, searching for the young private who had stood in the shadows of George Yard. And he would fail. Whether through honest uncertainty or through some failure of memory or through the simple fact that all soldiers in uniform tended to look alike to civilian eyes, Barrett could not identify the man. He picked out one soldier, then changed his mind and picked out another. Neither man could account for his whereabouts on the night of the murder in a way that satisfied the investigators. Neither man could be definitively linked to Martha Tabram. The lead evaporated, leaving only questions and suspicions and the bitter taste of failure. Pearly Pole, too, was brought to the tower for an identity parade, in hopes that she might recognise one or both of the soldiers she had spent the evening with. Her testimony had already proven unreliable. She had initially claimed that the soldiers belonged to the Grenadier Guards, then changed her story to suggest they might have been Coldstream Guards, a different regiment with different barracks and different personnel. When confronted with the men of each regiment in turn, she was unable to make a positive identification. She pointed at various soldiers with varying degrees of certainty, but none of her selections held up under scrutiny. The soldiers she accused all had alibis. The soldiers without alibis she failed to accuse. The investigation reached another dead end. The identity of the man who accompanied Martha Tabram into George Yard the man who was almost certainly her killer was never established. He walked out of the historical record as completely as he had walked into it, leaving behind nothing but a body and a mystery. The police would continue to investigate for weeks, following leads that led nowhere, questioning witnesses who knew nothing, assembling theories that could not be proven. In the end, they would be forced to admit defeat. Martha Tabram's murder would go unsolved, her killer unpunished, her death unavenged. But the shadow of that nameless soldier, if soldier he truly was, would stretch long over the months that followed. 3 weeks after Martha Tabram's body was found on the landing of George Yard Buildings, another woman would be discovered dead in the streets of Whitechapel, her throat cut, her body mutilated in ways that defied comprehension. And then another, and then another. The newspapers would give the killer a name that he himself may have chosen, a name that would echo through history with all the weight of nightmare: Jack the Ripper. Some investigators would come to believe that Martha Tabram's murder was the first act of that terrible drama, the opening scene in a season of slaughter that would terrorize London and captivate the world. Others would argue that her death was different in method, different in character, unconnected to the canonical killings that followed. The debate has never been settled. The evidence permits no certainty. Martha Tabram remains what she was in life, a figure on the margins, neither fully included nor fully excluded, hovering at the threshold of a history that has never quite known what to do with her. What is certain is this: on the night of August the 6th, 1888, a woman walked into the darkness with a man she did not know. She trusted him as she had trusted 100 men before him, because she had no choice but to trust, because trust was the price of survival in the economy of the streets, and he betrayed that trust in the most absolute way possible. He took from her not merely money or dignity, but life itself, leaving her broken and bleeding on a cold stone landing while the city slept, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the dawn crept closer with every passing minute. The soldier, if soldier he was, disappeared into the night. He left no trace, no clue, no confession. He went back to his barracks or his lodgings or wherever men like him went when their business was concluded. He washed the blood from his hands. He cleaned his blade. He lay down and slept, perhaps, or sat awake in the darkness contemplating what he had done. And then he rose and went about his life, while Martha Tabram's body cooled on the landing and the world continued turning without her. The shadow of that man has never lifted from George Yard. It lingers there still, in the imagination if not in fact, waiting in the darkness for the next woman to climb the stairs, the next transaction to be concluded, the next silence to be broken by violence. But on that August morning the silence remained unbroken. The sun rose over Whitechapel, the factory bells began to ring, and in George Yard Buildings a body waited to be found. Chapter 5. The Body on the Landing. The morning of August the 7th came to Whitechapel as all mornings came, grey and grudging, the sun filtering through a haze of coal smoke that never quite lifted from the rooftops, the streets slowly filling with the sounds of a district coming reluctantly back to life. The bank holiday was over. The factories were opening their gates again. The costermongers were wheeling their barrows into position along the commercial road. The women who had walked the streets all night were retreating to their lodging houses to sleep away the day. And in George Yard Buildings, the residents were stirring in their cramped flats, preparing to face another day of labour and want. John Saunders Reeves was a waterside labourer, a man who earned his bread loading and unloading cargo at the docks that lined the Thames below Tower Hill. His work began early, as the work of the poor always did, and on this particular morning he rose before 5 o'clock to begin his journey from his lodgings in George Yard Buildings to the wharves where his employer expected him. He dressed in the darkness of his room, ate whatever cold food was available, and ascended the stairs toward the street, his mind already occupied with the tasks that awaited him. He did not expect to find a body. She was lying on the first-floor landing, positioned on her back, her arms resting at her sides, her legs slightly parted, her clothing disarranged in a manner that suggested either violence or the transaction that had preceded violence. Her eyes were open, staring upward at the ceiling, seeing nothing. Her face was composed, almost peaceful, bearing no expression of fear or pain or surprise, but her body told a different story. Her chest and abdomen were dark with blood, her clothes saturated, the pooling liquid having spread across the stone beneath her and begun to congeal in the hours since her death. There was blood on the walls, there was blood on the stairs, there was blood everywhere Reeves looked. More blood than he had ever seen in his life, more blood than he had believed a human body could contain. Reeves was not a man given to panic. Life in Whitechapel did not permit the luxury of panic. One saw too much, endured too much, to be easily shocked by the cruelties of existence. But this was something beyond his experience. This was not a drunk collapsed in a doorway, not a vagrant sleeping off a night's excess, not even a victim of a common assault left bleeding but alive. This was death in its most absolute form, death that had been inflicted with a thoroughness and a savagery that defied understanding. Reeves turned and fled down the stairs, out into the street shouting for the police. Constable Thomas Barrett was the first officer to respond. He had been walking his beat on the nearby streets when he heard the commotion, and he arrived at George Yard buildings within minutes of Reeves's alarm. Barrett climbed the stairs and saw for himself what the labourer had discovered. The woman was clearly dead, had been dead for hours, judging by the state of her blood and the coldness of her skin. Barrett did not attempt to move her or examine her closely. He secured the scene as best he could and sent word to the commercial street police station, summoning the detectives and the divisional surgeon who would be required to conduct a proper investigation. The news spread quickly through the building and into the surrounding streets. By the time Inspector Edmund Reed arrived to take charge of the scene, a small crowd had gathered at the entrance to George Yard, craning their necks for a glimpse of whatever horror lay within. The residents of the building had emerged from their flats, some still in their nightclothes, whispering to one another in the hallways, speculating about what had happened, wondering who the dead woman might be. None of them recognized her face. She was not a resident. She was not a regular visitor. She was simply a stranger who had come to die on their doorstep, leaving them to deal with the aftermath. Dr. Timothy Robert Killeen, the divisional surgeon, arrived shortly after 9 o'clock to conduct his preliminary examination of the body. He was a man accustomed to death in all its forms: death by disease, death by accident, death by violence, but even he was struck by what he found on that first-floor landing. The woman had been stabbed repeatedly, her torso punctured by wounds too numerous to count at a glance. Killeen knelt beside the body, examining each wound in turn, noting its location and depth and character, building in his mind a picture of the attack that had ended this woman's life. The wounds numbered 39 in total, 39 separate stab wounds, concentrated primarily on the chest, abdomen, and lower body. The breasts had been penetrated multiple times. The belly had been opened in several places. The lungs had been pierced. The heart had been struck. The liver had been punctured. One wound, deeper and more violent than the others, had been inflicted with such force that it had penetrated the sternum, the breastbone, suggesting a weapon of considerable size and strength. The other wounds were consistent with a smaller blade, perhaps a penknife or a clasp knife of the sort that any common labourer might carry. 2 weapons, then, or one weapon of unusual design. Either possibility raised questions that Killeen could not answer. The nature of the wounds suggested frenzy, a sustained attack conducted with tremendous energy and apparent rage. The woman had been stabbed again and again and again, long past the point where death would have been certain, long past any rational purpose. This was not a murder committed for robbery, for her meagre possessions remained with her body. This was not a murder committed in the heat of a quarrel, for no one had heard raised voices or sounds of struggle. This was something else entirely, something methodical, and yet chaotic, something purposeful and yet excessive, something that spoke of a mind operating by rules that ordinary people could not comprehend. And yet, for all the violence of the attack, the woman's face remained unmarked. Her features were intact, her expression calm, her identity theoretically discoverable if anyone who knew her could be found to view the body. The killer had concentrated his fury on her torso, on the parts of her body that her clothing would normally conceal, leaving her face untouched as if by design. Whether this was significant and whether it indicated some particular psychology or methodology on the part of the murderer, Killeen could not say. He was a surgeon, not a detective. His task was to document the wounds, to establish the cause of death, and to provide whatever medical evidence might assist the police in their investigation. The interpretation of that evidence was someone else's responsibility. The body was removed from the landing and transported to the mortuary at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road, where a more thorough post-mortem examination could be conducted. The bloodstains on the landing were scrubbed away by the building's residents, who had no desire to live with such a reminder of what had occurred. The stairs were washed, the walls were cleaned. Within hours, the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings looked much as it had always looked, dim, narrow, unremarkable, indistinguishable from 1,000 other stairwells in 1,000 other tenement buildings across the East End. But the memory of what had been found there would not be so easily erased. The residents of the building spoke of nothing else for days afterward. They wondered who the woman had been, what she had been doing in their building, why she had been killed with such ferocity. They wondered too about the killer, whether he was a stranger who had wandered in from the streets, or someone they knew, someone they had passed on the stairs without suspecting what darkness he carried within him. They locked their doors more carefully at night. They listened more intently for unusual sounds. They looked at one another with new eyes, wondering which of their neighbours might be capable of such an act. The police, meanwhile, began the laborious process of identification. The woman carried no papers, no letters, no documents that might establish her name or address. Her clothing was of the cheapest sort, offering no clues to her origins. Her face was unknown to the residents of George Yard buildings and to the constables who walked the surrounding beats. She was, in death as in life, a cipher, one of the countless anonymous poor who drifted through Whitechapel without leaving any trace of their passage. It was Pearlie Pole who eventually provided the identification. She'd heard the rumours circulating through the lodging houses and public houses of the district. Rumours of a woman found dead in George Yard, stabbed dozens of times, her body left on a stairwell for the morning to discover. Pearlie Pole knew, with a certainty that required no confirmation, that the dead woman was Martha Tabram, Martha Turner, Emma, the woman she'd spent the bank holiday evening with, the woman who had walked into the darkness with a soldier and never returned. Pearlie Pole went to the police. She went reluctantly, knowing that her profession made her a suspect as much as a witness, knowing that the questions would be uncomfortable and the scrutiny unwelcome. But she went because Martha deserved that much at least, because someone needed to give the dead woman back her name. She viewed the body at the mortuary and confirmed what she already knew. The woman on the slab was her companion, her drinking partner, her fellow traveller through the hard streets of Whitechapel. Martha Tabram had walked into George Yard and had never walked out again. The investigation now had a name and a history to work with. Martha Tabram, née White, aged 39, estranged from her husband, separated from her common-law partner, a woman of the streets who'd been seen in the company of soldiers on the night of her death. The detectives of H Division began to pursue their leads with renewed energy. The soldiers must be found. The soldiers must be questioned. The soldiers must be made to answer for what had happened on that dark landing in the early hours of August the 7th. But the soldiers, as we have seen, would prove elusive. The identity parades would fail. The witnesses would contradict themselves and each other. The trail would grow cold even as the investigation heated up, and Martha Tabram's killer would remain what he had always been, a shadow, a phantom, a figure glimpsed briefly in the gaslight before disappearing forever into the darkness that had spawned him. The body on the landing had been found. The body on the landing had been named. But the body on the landing would never be avenged. Chapter 6. 39 Wounds. The mortuary of the Working Lads Institute was a grim place, as all mortuaries were grim in those days. A cold room with stone floors and whitewashed walls, illuminated by whatever light filtered through high, narrow windows, equipped with the basic implements of post-mortem examination and little else. It was here that the bodies of Whitechapel's dead were brought when death occurred under circumstances that required official inquiry. Here that surgeons and coroners attempted to extract truth from flesh. Here that the final indignities were visited upon those who had already suffered so much in life. Martha Tabram's body arrived at the mortuary on the morning of August the 7th, and was laid out on the examination table to await the scrutiny of Dr. Killeen. The preliminary examination at George Yard had established the basic facts: multiple stab wounds, massive blood loss, death occurring some hours before the body's discovery. But a proper post-mortem would be required to document the full extent of the injuries, to establish the cause and manner of death with legal certainty, and to gather whatever evidence might assist the police in identifying and apprehending the killer. Killeen conducted his examination with the methodical thoroughness that the situation demanded. He began by removing and cataloguing the victim's clothing, the worn and faded garments of a woman who owned little and could afford less. The clothes were heavily blood-stained, saturated in some areas, splashed and spattered in others, testifying to the violence of the attack and the quantity of blood that had been shed. Beneath the clothing, the body itself bore witness to that violence, in terms that could not be misunderstood. 39 stab wounds. Killeen counted them one by one, noting the location and characteristics of each. 9 wounds to the throat and neck, 17 wounds to the chest and breasts. 13 wounds to the abdomen and lower body. The wounds varied in depth and severity, some penetrating only an inch or two into the flesh, others driving deep into the vital organs beneath. The lungs had been pierced in 5 places, the heart had been struck twice, the liver had been penetrated, the spleen had been nicked. It was, Killeen concluded, a wonder that the woman had not died more quickly than she apparently had, though in truth, with wounds of such severity, death would have come within minutes at most. The pattern of the wound suggested something about the manner of the attack, though Killeen was careful not to speculate beyond what the evidence could support. The concentration of wounds on the chest and abdomen, combined with the relative absence of defensive injuries to the hands and arms, suggested that the victim had been taken by surprise, or had been incapacitated before she could resist, or had been restrained in some manner that prevented her from fighting back. The victim had been found on her back, her arms at her sides, in a position that might have resulted from a sexual encounter interrupted by sudden violence. The disarrangement of her clothing was consistent with this theory. So too was the location of the attack, a dark landing where a woman might bring a customer for a few minutes of hurried commerce. But it was the nature of the wounds themselves that most troubled Dr. Killeen, and that would most perplex the investigators in the weeks to come. The majority of the wounds, 38 of the 39, were consistent with a relatively small blade, perhaps 3 or 4 inches in length, of the sort that might be found in any penknife or pocket knife carried by working men throughout the city. Such a blade could inflict serious injury, could certainly kill if applied with sufficient force and frequency, but it would require considerable effort to penetrate deep into the body's vital organs. The 39th wound was different. It was located in the chest, penetrating the sternum, the breastbone, and driving deep into the chest cavity beneath. The sternum is a thick plate of bone, not easily pierced, and the wound that had penetrated it must have been inflicted with tremendous force by a much larger and stronger blade. Killeen estimated that this wound had been made by a dagger or bayonet-type weapon, something with a blade at least 5 or 6 inches in length and sturdy enough to break through bone. This was not the kind of weapon that an ordinary civilian would carry. This was a military weapon, or something very like one. 2 weapons, then. 2 blades of distinctly different character, used in the same attack on the same victim, by what was presumably the same attacker. The implications were troubling. Had the killer come to the encounter armed with both weapons, anticipating the violence he intended to commit? Had he carried a bayonet, or something like a bayonet, alongside his ordinary pocket knife, prepared to use whichever seemed most appropriate to the moment? Or had something else occurred, something that the evidence could not reveal, some sequence of events that led to Martha Tabram's body being punctured by 2 different blades in rapid succession? The 2-weapon theory would become one of the central puzzles of the Martha Tabram case, debated by investigators and armchair detectives alike for more than a century. Some would argue that it proved the killer was a soldier, trained in the use of the bayonet and carrying one as part of his regular kit. Others would argue that 2 weapons implied 2 attackers, that Martha had been set upon by both soldiers she had accompanied that evening, killed in a frenzy of shared violence. Still others would suggest that the differences between the wounds had been exaggerated, that a single weapon of unusual design might account for the variations, that the entire 2-weapon theory was a red herring leading the investigation astray. The truth could not be extracted from the body alone. The truth required witnesses, confessions, evidence that the mortuary could not provide. All Dr. Killeen could offer was description, the precise cataloguing of what had been done to Martha Tabram in the final minutes of her life, the medical facts that would be entered into the official record and presented at the coroner's inquest. He noted the wounds. He measured their depth. He estimated the time of death at approximately 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning, based on the state of the blood and the temperature of the body when discovered. He recorded his findings and submitted them to the police. The body was then cleaned, dressed in a plain shroud, and placed in a simple coffin to await burial. Martha Tabram had no family to claim her. Her estranged husband had not seen her in years. Her sons had been raised without her. Her common-law partner had abandoned her weeks before her death. She would be buried at the public expense in a pauper's grave, her final resting place unmarked and unremembered. It was the fate of so many who died in Whitechapel, their lives leaving no more trace than their deaths, their names fading from memory within months of their passing. But Martha Tabram's name would not fade. Not entirely. Not yet. The savagery of her murder, the mystery of the 2 weapons, the failure of the police to identify a suspect. All of these factors combined to keep her case alive in the public consciousness longer than such cases usually survived. The newspapers, always hungry for sensation, printed accounts of the killing that emphasized its most lurid details. The residents of Whitechapel, already anxious about the dangers of their streets, grew more fearful still. And among the detectives of H Division, a troubling suspicion began to take shape. A suspicion that Martha Tabram's murder was not an isolated incident, that the killer who had climbed those stairs and wielded those blades was not finished, that the violence of August the 7th was merely a prelude to something far worse. 39 wounds, 39 separate acts of violence, each one a choice, each one a decision to continue when stopping was possible, each one a statement about the nature of the mind that had conceived and executed this attack. Whatever else might be uncertain about Martha Tabram's death, one thing was clear: she had not been killed by accident, or in a moment of passion, or in the ordinary course of a robbery gone wrong. She had been killed by someone who wanted to kill, who needed to kill, who found in the act of killing something that satisfied a hunger beyond ordinary comprehension. Such a person would not stop at one. Such a person would kill again. The summer of 1888 was not yet half over. The worst was still to come. Chapter 7. The Parade of Soldiers. The investigation into Martha Tabram's murder proceeded along the only lines available to the detectives of H Division. The patient, methodical pursuit of leads that might connect a name and a face to the violence that had occurred on the first-floor landing of George Yard buildings. The police of 1888 had no forensic science in the modern sense, no fingerprinting techniques, no blood analysis, no DNA testing that might extract the killer's identity from the traces he had left behind. They had only witnesses, and the hope that those witnesses might provide information sufficient to identify the guilty party. The witnesses in this case pointed towards soldiers. Pearlie Pole had stated clearly that she and Martha had spent the evening of August the 6th in the company of 2 soldiers, privates in uniform, whom they had met in the public houses of Whitechapel Road. She had described the soldiers in terms that were vague but not entirely useless. Young men, she thought, with the cap badges and accoutrements of one of the Guards' regiments stationed at the Tower of London. Constable Barrett had encountered a soldier loitering near the entrance to George Yard at approximately 2:30 in the morning. A soldier who had claimed to be waiting for a companion who had gone off with a girl. Dr. Killeen had suggested that one of the wounds in Martha's body might have been inflicted by a bayonet or similar military weapon. Taken together, these fragments of evidence pointed toward the garrison at the tower. The detectives resolved to pursue this lead with all the resources at their disposal. Inspector Edmund Reed, who had taken charge of the investigation, began by making inquiries at the Tower of London regarding any soldiers who had been absent from barracks on the night of the murder, or who had returned in a dishevelled or blood-stained condition, or who had otherwise attracted suspicion. The commanding officers of the Guards regiment stationed there cooperated with the investigation, providing access to personnel records and making their men available for questioning. The army had no desire to protect a murderer in its ranks, and the officers understood that failure to cooperate would only deepen suspicion and prolong the inquiry. The first identity parade was arranged for August the 15th, more than a week after the murder. Constable Barrett, who had encountered the soldier near George Yard, was brought to the tower to view the men of the Grenadier Guards, the regiment he believed the soldier had belonged to, based on the uniform he had observed. The men were assembled in ranks, standing at attention, their faces blank and their eyes forward, while Barrett walked slowly along the lines, studying each face in turn, searching for the young private he had spoken to in the early hours of August the 7th. Barrett was not certain. He had seen the soldier only briefly in poor light, under circumstances that had not seemed particularly memorable at the time. The faces before him now were similar in age and build, distinguished from one another only by subtle variations in feature and expression that were difficult to read in the formal setting of a military parade. Barrett hesitated. He looked again. Finally he pointed to one soldier and declared that this was the man he had seen. The soldier's name was John Leary, a private with a good service record and no history of violence or misconduct. When questioned, Leary insisted that he had been in barracks on the night of the murder, a claim that was supported by the testimony of his fellow soldiers and by the records of the duty sergeant. He had not been in Whitechapel. He had not been near George Yard. He had never seen Martha Tabram alive or dead. Barrett's identification, it seemed, was mistaken. Reed did not give up. He arranged a second parade, this time inviting Pearlie Pole to view the soldiers and attempt to identify the 2 men she had spent the evening with. Pearlie Pole was a more problematic witness than Barrett. Her memory was clouded by alcohol. Her statements had already proven inconsistent, and her profession made her inherently unreliable in the eyes of respectable society. But she was the only witness who had seen both soldiers clearly, who had spoken with them, who had walked beside them through the streets of Whitechapel. If anyone could identify Martha Tabram's last companions, it was she. The parade was held on August the 15th, the same day as Barrett's attempt. Pearlie Pole was escorted to the tower and presented with the assembled ranks of the Grenadier Guards. She walked along the lines as Barrett had done, studying faces, searching for recognition. She pointed to 2 soldiers and declared that these were the men, but there was a problem. The soldiers she identified both had solid alibis for the night of the murder. They had been confined to barracks under the supervision of the duty sergeant, and could not possibly have been in Whitechapel at the times Pearlie Pole claimed to have been with them. Either she was mistaken, or she was lying, or the soldiers she had actually spent the evening with belonged to a different regiment entirely. The investigation pivoted. Pearlie Pole had initially stated that the soldiers were Grenadier Guards, but when pressed, she admitted uncertainty. Perhaps they had been Coldstream Guards instead, a different regiment with similar uniforms stationed at different barracks. Reed arranged for Pearlie Pole to view the men of the Coldstream Guards as well, in a parade held at the Wellington Barracks on August the 21st. The result was the same. Pearlie Pole identified 2 soldiers. The soldiers had alibis. The identifications could not be sustained. By now, nearly 3 weeks had passed since Martha Tabram's murder, and the investigation had made no meaningful progress. The soldier theory, which had seemed so promising in the immediate aftermath of the killing, had led only to dead ends and false identifications. Barrett could not reliably identify the man he had seen. Pearlie Pole could not reliably identify the men she had been with. The 2-weapon theory suggested military involvement, but suggested was not the same as proved. The killer, whoever he was, remained at large, unpunished and unidentified. Inspector Reed and his colleagues were forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The murder of Martha Tabram might never be solved. This was not an unusual outcome for crimes committed in Whitechapel, where witnesses were unreliable, evidence was scarce, and the victims were often so marginalised that their deaths attracted little sustained attention. Martha Tabram had been a woman of the streets, a drunkard, a person of no consequence in the eyes of respectable society. Her murder was a tragedy, certainly, but it was not the kind of tragedy that demanded resolution at any cost. The resources of the Metropolitan Police were limited. Other crimes required attention. Life in Whitechapel went on. The identity parades concluded without result. The soldiers returned to their duties. Pearlie Pole returned to the streets. The detectives filed their reports and turned their attention to other matters. Martha Tabram's file remained open, technically, but no new leads emerged, no new witnesses came forward, no breakthrough occurred that might have brought her killer to justice. The case settled into the limbo of unsolved murders, neither closed nor actively pursued, simply waiting for something that might never come. But something did come, something far worse than anyone had anticipated. On August the 31st, 1888, less than 4 weeks after Martha Tabram's body was found on the landing of George Yard buildings, another woman was discovered dead in Whitechapel. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, and she had been killed with a savagery that surpassed even what had been done to Martha. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. Her abdomen had been slashed open, her intestines exposed. The attack bore the hallmarks of the same frenzied violence that had claimed Martha Tabram, but intensified, refined, carried to a new extreme of horror. The police began to suspect that they were dealing not with isolated incidents, but with a series, a pattern of killings committed by the same individual, a murderer who was selecting his victims from among the most vulnerable women of Whitechapel and destroying them with increasing ferocity. The newspapers seized upon this theory with ghoulish enthusiasm, dubbing the unknown killer with names that range from the sensational to the absurd. Eventually, one name would emerge above all others, a name that the killer himself may have chosen, a name that would become synonymous with terror and mystery: Jack the Ripper. Martha Tabram was never officially included in the canonical list of Ripper victims. Her wounds were stab wounds, not the slashing cuts and abdominal mutilations that would characterize the later killings. Her murder had occurred before the pattern became clear, before the police understood what they were dealing with. She remained, in the official record, a separate case, connected to the Ripper by proximity and timing, but not definitively attributed to him. And yet the shadow of her death stretched long over everything that followed. She was the first, or perhaps she was not the first, but merely the first to be noticed. Either way, she stood at the threshold of the autumn of terror, a harbinger of the horrors to come, a woman whose murder announced that something had changed in the streets of Whitechapel, that a new kind of predator was moving through the darkness, that the lamplit abyss had given birth to something that would haunt the world's imagination for more than a century. The parade of soldiers had yielded nothing. The investigation had failed. The killer walked free, and the nightmare was only beginning. Chapter 8. The Inquest at the Working Lads Institute. The Working Lads Institute stood on Whitechapel Road, a modest building dedicated to the improvement and education of the young men of the district, a place where lectures were given, classes were held, and the deserving poor might better themselves through application and effort. It was also, by arrangement with the local authorities, the site of the coroner's court for the Whitechapel district, the place where inquests were held into deaths that occurred under circumstances requiring official inquiry. The same rooms that hosted evening classes in arithmetic and reading were transformed, when death demanded, into chambers of legal proceeding, where juries of ordinary citizens heard evidence and rendered verdicts on how and why their neighbours had died. The inquest into the death of Martha Tabram opened on Thursday, the 9th of August, 1888, 2 days after her body had been discovered on the landing of George Yard buildings. The coroner was George Collier, the Deputy Coroner for the South Eastern Division of Middlesex, a man experienced in the grim business of investigating violent death among the poor. The jury consisted of local tradesmen and householders, men who knew Whitechapel and its dangers, who understood the world in which Martha Tabram had lived and died. They gathered in the Institute's meeting room, arranged themselves on the benches provided, and prepared to hear what could be learned about the murder that had occurred in their midst. The proceedings began, as all inquests began, with the formal identification of the body. Henry Samuel Tabram, Martha's estranged husband, had been located by the police and brought to the mortuary to view the remains. It had been 13 years since he had last seen his wife, 13 years since he had walked away from her drinking and her chaos and her slow collapse into degradation. The woman on the mortuary slab bore little resemblance to the woman he had married on that Christmas morning in 1869, but he recognised her nonetheless. He confirmed that the deceased was Martha Tabram, his lawful wife, from whom he had been separated since 1875. His testimony was brief and colourless, the testimony of a man who had long since ceased to feel anything for the woman whose name he still bore. The coroner then called the witnesses who could speak to the circumstances of Martha's death, beginning with John Saunders Reeves, the waterside labourer who had discovered the body. Reeves described his descent of the stairs in the early morning darkness, his encounter with what he had initially taken to be a sleeping vagrant, his dawning realization that the figure on the landing was not asleep but dead. He spoke of the blood, the quantity of it, the way it had spread across the stones and begun to dry in the hours since the killing. He spoke of his alarm, his flight into the street, his summons of the police. His testimony was straightforward and uncontested. He had seen what he had seen. He had done what anyone would have done. He had no knowledge of who the woman was or how she had come to be there. Alfred George Crowe, the cab driver who had passed the body on the stairs at 3:30 in the morning, was called next. His testimony was more troubling, for it raised questions about why the body had not been discovered sooner. Crowe admitted that he had seen a figure lying on the first-floor landing as he ascended to his own lodgings, but had assumed it was merely a vagrant or a drunk and had not stopped to investigate. He had stepped around the figure and continued on his way, thinking nothing of it. The coroner pressed him on this point. Had he not thought it strange to find someone lying on the landing at such an hour? Had he not considered that the person might be in distress, might need assistance? Crowe could only shrug and explain that such sights were common in Whitechapel, that one learned not to interfere, that the figure had shown no signs of injury that he could see in the darkness. He was not proud of his indifference, but neither was he apologetic. He had behaved as anyone in his position would have behaved. The streets of Whitechapel did not reward curiosity. The testimony of the police officers followed. Constable Barrett, who had been the first to respond to Reeves's alarm, and Inspector Reed, who had taken charge of the investigation. Barrett described the condition of the body as he had found it, the positioning, the blood, the absence of any weapon or obvious clue to the killer's identity. He also described his earlier encounter with the soldier near the entrance to George Yard, the young private who had claimed to be waiting for a friend. This testimony generated considerable interest among the jury, for it suggested a potential suspect, a lead that might be pursued. But Barrett was forced to admit that his subsequent attempts to identify the soldier had failed, that the identity parades at the tower had yielded no reliable result, that the man he had seen remained unknown. Inspector Reed summarised the state of the investigation as it stood. The police had interviewed numerous witnesses, conducted multiple identity parades, and pursued every lead that had presented itself. They had established that Martha Tabram had spent the evening of August the 6th in the company of 2 soldiers, drinking in various public houses along Whitechapel Road. They had established that she had been last seen alive at approximately 11:30, when she and her companion Pearlie Pole had separated to conduct their respective business with their respective customers. They had established that she had been killed sometime between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning, stabbed 39 times with what appeared to be 2 different weapons, but they had not established who had killed her, or why, or what had become of him after the murder. The investigation was ongoing, Reed assured the jury, but he could not promise a swift resolution. The medical evidence was presented by Dr. Timothy Robert Killeen, who had conducted the post-mortem examination. Killeen's testimony was detailed and clinical, a recitation of wounds and injuries that reduced Martha Tabram's violent death to a catalogue of anatomical facts. He described the 39 stab wounds, their distribution across the body, their varying depths and characteristics. He described the wound to the sternum, which had penetrated the breastbone and which he believed had been inflicted by a larger weapon than the others, a dagger perhaps, or a bayonet. He described the damage to the internal organs, the punctured lungs and pierced heart and lacerated liver. He estimated the time of death and confirmed that the cause was hemorrhage resulting from the multiple stab wounds. The woman had bled to death on the landing where she was found, probably within minutes of the attack commencing. The jury listened to this testimony with the grim attention that such details demanded. They were not squeamish men. Life in Whitechapel did not permit squeamishness, but even they were struck by the savagery of what had been done to Martha Tabram. 39 wounds. The number itself seemed almost impossible, seemed to speak of a frenzy beyond ordinary violence, beyond anything that could be explained by robbery or quarrel or momentary rage. Whoever had killed Martha Tabram had wanted her dead with an intensity that defied comprehension. He had stabbed her again and again and again, long after she had ceased to resist, long after life had fled her body, as if the act of killing itself was the purpose and the victim merely the occasion. The final witness was Mary Ann Connolly, known as Pearlie Pole, the woman who had spent the fatal evening in Martha's company. Pearlie Pole was a reluctant witness, uncomfortable with the official proceedings, aware that her profession made her an object of suspicion and contempt in the eyes of respectable society. But she'd come forward to identify the body, and she could not now refuse to testify about what she knew. She described the evening of August the 6th, the drinking, the soldiers, the parting at the entrance to George Yard. She described the soldiers as best she could remember them, though her descriptions remained vague and her identifications at the tower had proven unreliable. She could not say with certainty which regiment they had belonged to, could not describe their faces clearly, could not provide the names they might or might not have given her. She had been drinking heavily that night, as she drank heavily most nights. The details had blurred into the general haze of alcohol and fatigue that characterized her existence. The coroner questioned her closely about the soldiers, about their appearance and manner, about anything that might help the police identify them. Pearlie Pole did her best to cooperate, but her best was not good enough. She contradicted herself, hesitated, admitted uncertainty. The soldiers she had pointed out at the identity parades had all been cleared by their alibis. The soldiers she had actually been with remained as shadowy and elusive as the killer himself. Perhaps they were the same men, Perhaps they were not. Pearlipole could not say, and no one else could say for her. The inquest was adjourned after the first day's testimony to be resumed on the 23rd of August, by which time the police hoped to have made further progress in their investigation. But when the proceedings resumed, little had changed. No new witnesses had come forward. No new evidence had emerged. The identity of Martha Tabram's killer remained as mysterious as ever. The jury retired to consider their verdict. The options available to them were limited by law and by the evidence they had heard. They could not name a murderer, for no murderer had been identified. They could not attribute the killing to any specific individual, for no individual had been shown to be responsible. All they could do was render a verdict on how Martha Tabram had died, leaving the question of who had killed her for the police to answer, if they ever could. The verdict, when it came, was brief and unsurprising. Willful murder by some person or persons unknown. It was the verdict that the evidence demanded, the only verdict that honesty would permit. Martha Tabram had been murdered. The murder remained unsolved. The killer remained at large. The coroner thanked the jury for their service, ordered the body released for burial, and closed the proceedings. The case file would remain open, technically, but everyone in the room understood that justice for Martha Tabram was unlikely to be achieved. She had lived in obscurity and died in violence, and the mystery of her death would follow her into the grave. The Working Lads Institute returned to its ordinary functions. The benches were rearranged, the legal papers were filed away, and the room was prepared for the next evening's lecture on some improving topic. Life in Whitechapel continued as it always had, indifferent to the fates of individual women, concerned only with the immediate business of survival. Martha Tabram was buried in a pauper's grave, her final resting place unmarked and unmourned, her name already fading from the consciousness of those who had known her. But death was not finished with Whitechapel. Even as the inquest concluded, even as the jury rendered its verdict of murder by persons unknown, the shadow that had claimed Martha Tabram was preparing to strike again. The autumn of terror was approaching, and the lamplit streets would soon run red with blood that would never be forgotten. Chapter 9. The Shadow Before the Storm. The weeks that followed Martha Tabram's death were ordinary weeks in Whitechapel, which is to say they were weeks of grinding poverty, of desperate commerce, of small cruelties and smaller mercies exchanged among people who expected nothing from life but survival. The murder on George Yard had caused a brief sensation, a flurry of newspaper coverage and public concern. But such sensations were short-lived in a district where tragedy was commonplace, and attention spans were limited by the demands of daily existence. The residents of George Yard buildings scrubbed the bloodstains from their landing and went about their business. The women who walked the streets at night continued to walk, because they had no other choice, because the alternative was starvation, or the workhouse, because fear was a luxury they could not afford. And somewhere in the darkness, unseen and unsuspected, the thing that had killed Martha Tabram waited. Whether that thing was a man or a monster, whether it walked on two legs or crawled on all fours, whether it had a name that would one day be spoken or a face that would one day be seen, these questions would occupy detectives and theorists for more than a century. What is certain is that the violence of August the 7th was not an ending but a beginning, not an isolated incident but the first note in a symphony of horror that would crescendo through the autumn months and echo down through the ages. The theory that Martha Tabram was killed by the same hand that would later be attributed to Jack the Ripper has been debated endlessly by those who study such matters. The arguments against the connection are substantial. Martha was stabbed, not slashed. Her wounds were punctures, not the sweeping cuts that would characterize the canonical Ripper murders. Her body was not mutilated in the specific manner that would become the Ripper's signature, the abdominal evisceration, the organ removal, the methodical destruction of the female form. She was killed indoors, on a stairwell landing, not in the open streets where the later victims would be found. The weapon, or weapons used against her, were different from the long-bladed knife that would be employed in subsequent attacks. On these grounds, many scholars have excluded Martha Tabram from the Ripper's tally, classifying her death as a separate crime, perhaps committed by a soldier, perhaps by some other assailant entirely unknown. But the arguments for the connection are equally compelling. Martha Tabram was killed in Whitechapel, in the same small cluster of streets where all the canonical victims would meet their ends. She was a woman of the streets, as all the canonical victims were women of the streets, selected from the same vulnerable population, engaged in the same desperate trade. She was killed in the early morning hours, in a location of shadow and solitude, in circumstances that suggested a transaction interrupted by sudden violence, the same pattern that would repeat itself again and again in the weeks to come. And the savagery of her murder, the sheer number of wounds inflicted upon her body, spoke of a rage and a compulsion that seemed far beyond ordinary criminal violence, that seemed to demand repetition, that seemed unlikely to be satisfied by a single killing. The detectives of H Division, working in the immediate aftermath of the murder, did not have the benefit of hindsight. They did not know that more killings were coming, did not know that Martha Tabram's death would come to be seen as the possible prologue to a reign of terror. They investigated her murder as they would have investigated any murder, methodically, patiently, within the limits of their resources and their understanding. When the investigation stalled, when the leads ran dry and the witnesses proved unreliable, they did what police always did in such circumstances. They moved on to other cases, other crimes, other demands on their time and attention. 3 weeks passed. The summer heat began to fade. The nights grew longer and darker. And on the last day of August, in the early hours of the morning, a woman named Mary Ann Nichols was found dead in Bucks Row, a narrow street less than half a mile from George Yard. Nichols had been killed with a violence that surpassed even what had been done to Martha Tabram. Her throat had been cut twice, the wound so deep that the knife had scraped against the vertebrae of her spine. Her abdomen had been slashed open, the incisions running jagged and deep, exposing the intestines beneath. The attack bore the hallmarks of frenzy, of a killer who could not or would not stop, who continued his work long after death had been achieved. But it also bore the hallmarks of something else, a certain precision, a certain focus that suggested purpose rather than mere madness. The police recognized immediately that they were dealing with something unprecedented. A single murder, however savage, might be attributed to a moment of rage, a quarrel gone wrong, a transaction turned fatal. But 2 murders, committed within weeks of each other, in the same small district, against the same type of victim, with the same excessive violence. This was a pattern, and patterns implied a single hand, a single mind, a single killer who had struck twice and might well strike again. The investigation into Mary Ann Nichols's murder proceeded in parallel with the still open investigation into Martha Tabram's death. The detectives began to see connections, or what seemed like connections, between the 2 cases. Both victims were women of the streets. Both had been killed in the small hours of the morning. Both had been attacked with extraordinary ferocity, their bodies bearing wounds far in excess of what would have been necessary to cause death. The differences between the cases, the stabbing versus the slashing, the indoor location versus the outdoor location, might be explained by a killer who was refining his methods, who was learning from experience, who was evolving towards some terrible perfection. This was the theory that began to take shape in the minds of the detectives and in the pages of the newspapers, that Whitechapel harboured a murderer of a type that London had never seen before, a predator who selected his victims from among the most vulnerable women of the district and destroyed them with a savagery that defied explanation. The theory was terrifying because it implied that the killings would continue, that no woman who walked the streets at night was safe, that the police were hunting something they did not understand and might not be able to catch. September brought more death. Annie Chapman was found on the 8th of the month. her body mutilated in ways that went far beyond anything seen before. Her abdomen laid open, her intestines drawn out and placed over her shoulder, her uterus removed entirely and taken away by the killer. The newspapers erupted, the public panicked. The name Jack the Ripper entered the public consciousness, drawn from a letter sent to the Central News Agency that claimed responsibility for the murders in language that was mocking, taunting, almost playful in its cruelty. Whether the letter was genuine or a hoax has never been determined, but the name stuck, and with it came a mythology that would outlive everyone involved. Victims, investigators, and perhaps even the killer himself. Martha Tabram's murder receded into the background as the Ripper's canonical victims claimed the spotlight. She had been killed before the pattern became clear, before the public understood what was happening, before the name Jack the Ripper had been invented to give shape to their fears. She did not fit neatly into the narrative that was emerging, the story of a knife-wielding maniac who stalked the streets and eviscerated his victims with surgical precision. Her wounds were different. Her death was different. And so, gradually she was separated from the others, relegated to a footnote, remembered only as a possible victim, a probable precursor, a shadow before the storm. But those who studied the case most closely could not dismiss her so easily. They saw in her murder the first stirrings of whatever madness would later consume Whitechapel, the initial expression of an impulse that would grow more focused and more terrible with each subsequent killing. Martha Tabram was not killed by accident. She was not killed in a robbery or a quarrel. She was killed by someone who wanted to kill, who needed to kill, who found in her body an outlet for urges that demanded release. That such a killer would stop after a single murder seemed improbable, that he would refine his methods, develop his signature, pursue his compulsion to its ultimate expression. This seemed far more likely. The shadow that fell across George Yard on the night of August the 6th was the same shadow that would darken Bucks Row and Hanbury Street, and Mitre Square and Dorset Street in the weeks that followed. It was the shadow of a mind that saw women like Martha Tabram not as human beings, but as objects, as vessels for violence, as blank canvases upon which to paint in blood. Whether that mind belonged to one man or several, whether it was driven by madness or malice or some unfathomable combination of both, whether it was ever identified or punished or brought to any kind of justice, these questions have never been answered. What is answered, what is certain, what cannot be disputed, is that Martha Tabram was the first to fall. She walked into the darkness on the night of August the 6th, trusting a stranger as she had trusted 100 strangers before, expecting nothing worse than the ordinary degradations of her trade. She found instead a death of unimaginable violence, a death that announced to the world that something new and terrible had awakened in the streets of Whitechapel. The storm was coming. Martha Tabram was its first casualty, and the shadow that killed her would not rest until it had claimed 4 more lives, or perhaps 5, or perhaps more, for the true number of the Ripper's victims may never be known. Now, Chapter 10. The Silence of George Yard. The autumn of 1888 burned itself into the memory of London with a ferocity that no amount of time could extinguish. The murders continued through September and into November. Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, Kelly, each killing more savage than the last, each victim discovered in circumstances more horrifying than what had come before. The newspapers screamed. The public raged. The police floundered, pursuing leads that led nowhere, arresting suspects who were later released, receiving letters that might have been genuine confessions, or might have been cruel hoaxes perpetrated by those who found amusement in terror. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the killing stopped. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on the 9th of November, no more victims were found, no more bodies were discovered, no more atrocities were committed, at least none that could be definitively attributed to the same hand. The Ripper, whoever he was, had vanished as completely as he had appeared. leaving behind only questions that would never be answered and wounds that would never heal. But what of Martha Tabram, the woman who may have been his first victim? The woman whose death had heralded the season of slaughter. History in its cruel selectivity largely forgot her. The canonical five, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, Kelly, claimed the attention of investigators and chroniclers, their names recited like a litany of martyrdom, their faces reproduced in books and documentaries, their stories told and retold until they achieved a kind of immortality in death that they had never known in life. Martha Tabram remained on the margins, included in some accounts and excluded from others, never quite admitted to the company of the Ripper's definitive victims, never quite expelled from it either. The reasons for this ambiguity are not difficult to understand. Martha's murder did not fit the pattern that emerged with the later killings. She was stabbed, not slashed. Her wounds were punctures, not the distinctive cuts that would become the Ripper's signature. Her body was not eviscerated, her organs not removed, her form not arranged in the ritualistic displays that would characterize the canonical murders. The two-weapon theory suggested that her killer might have been a soldier, a possibility that did not align with the profiles that were later developed for the Ripper. And the investigation into her death had focused so heavily on the military angle that alternative theories had received little attention. Yet the connection could not be entirely dismissed. The timing was too close, the location too similar, the victim profile too consistent. Martha Tabram was killed 3 weeks before Mary Ann Nichols in the same small district of Whitechapel, in circumstances that suggested the same predatory selection of vulnerable women. The savagery of her murder, the sheer number of wounds, spoke of the same uncontrollable rage that would animate the later killings. If the Ripper had not killed Martha Tabram, then Whitechapel had harboured two separate murderers of women in the summer of 1888, operating independently, selecting victims from the same population, striking within weeks of each other, a coincidence so improbable as to strain credulity. The debate has never been resolved. Ripperologists, the term coined for those who study the case, continue to argue about Martha Tabram's place in the sequence of killings, some insisting that she must be included, others maintaining that she represents a separate crime by a separate killer. The truth is that no one knows. The evidence permits multiple interpretations. The killer never confessed, never identified himself, never explained what he had done or why. He took his secrets to the grave, assuming he died at all, assuming he was not still alive somewhere, an old man by the turn of the century carrying within him memories that no one else shared. George Yard itself has vanished from the map of London. The narrow passage where Martha Tabram took her last customer, the tenement building on whose landing she drew her final breath, the cobblestones that absorbed her blood, all of these have been swept away by the relentless tide of urban development. The East End of the 21st century bears little resemblance to the Whitechapel of 1888. The slums have been cleared, the tenements demolished, the warrens of courts and alleys replaced by modern buildings that know nothing of the horrors that once occurred on the ground where they stand. A visitor searching for George Yard today will find only Gunthorpe Street, a quiet lane that retains no trace of its former identity, no memorial to Martha Tabram, no acknowledgement that this was once a place where a woman was stabbed 39 times and left to die alone in the darkness. The silence of George Yard is complete. The stones that witnessed Martha Tabram's murder have been scattered, recycled, forgotten. The residents who slept through her killing have themselves long since died, taking with them whatever memories they might have retained. The police officers who investigated her death, the coroner who conducted her inquest, the jury who rendered the verdict of murder by persons unknown, all have passed beyond the reach of inquiry. Even the records of the case are fragmentary, preserved imperfectly in archives that have themselves been damaged by time and war and neglect. What remains is a name, a date, a number, 39, and a mystery that will never be solved. Martha Tabram was buried in a pauper's grave in the East London cemetery. Her plot unmarked, her resting place forgotten even before the grass had grown over her remains. She had no family to mourn her, no friends to remember her, no monument to preserve her name for posterity. She was one of thousands who died in Whitechapel in those years, one of countless women whose lives were ground down by poverty and desperation and violence, whose deaths were recorded in the coldest official language and then filed away never to be examined again. And yet, she is remembered. Not as she would have wished to be remembered, perhaps, not as a woman with a history and a heart and hopes of her own, but as a victim, as a puzzle, as a name in a list of names that has achieved a terrible fame. Martha Tabram endures because she died in a particular way, at a particular time, in a particular place, because her death brushed against one of the great mysteries of the modern age, because her blood was shed in what may have been the first act of a drama that captivated the world. She's been given a kind of immortality, however grim, however unwanted. The night she died, the candles burned low in the lodging houses of Whitechapel. The gas lamps flickered in their casings. The residents of George Yard slept on, unaware of what had happened on the landing below them, unaware that they were living through the opening moments of a legend. By morning, the world would know that a woman had been murdered. By autumn, the world would know that a monster was loose in the streets of London. But on that night, in those final hours before dawn, there was only darkness and silence and the slow cooling of a body that no one had yet discovered. Martha Tabram lay on the cold stones, her eyes open to a ceiling she could no longer see, her hands resting at her sides, her wounds no longer bleeding because there was no more blood to shed. She had walked into the darkness expecting to survive, as she had survived 1,000 nights before. She had not survived. She had become instead the first entry in a ledger of blood that would never be balanced, the first victim of a killer who would never be caught, the first whisper in a story that the world would never stop telling. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history, once again, turned the page in the dark. Rest now, dear listener, wherever you are. Let the weight of these old sorrows settle into the quiet of your night. Martha Tabram has been remembered, her story has been told, and in the telling perhaps some small measure of the debt that history owes her has been paid. Sleep well. The Bedside Historian will be here when you return, waiting with another tale from the shadows, another voice from the silence, another light held against the darkness that never quite fades. Until then, good night.